My name is Michael Taylor, and I'm 71 years old, sitting here alone in my Seattle home that once echoed with the laughter of two children, but now feels like a tomb of silence, because my daughter Sarah looked me in the eyes at her brother's funeral and said the words that shattered my heart forever. "I wish it had been you instead of him who died in that car crash." 8 months ago, I lost my son David in a tragic accident, and within hours of burying him, I discovered that my grief had cost me not just one child, but both of them, because Sarah holds me responsible for her brother's death and has vowed never to speak to me again. I'd love to know where you're listening from today, so please share your location in the comment below. And if this story moves you, I hope you'll consider subscribing, because what happened to me shows how quickly grief can destroy a family and turn love into unforgivable hatred. Let me start by telling you about the family I used to have, so you can understand the magnitude of what I lost and how a father's love became twisted into evidence of favoritism and blame. I raised 2 children with my late wife Margaret in a beautiful house overlooking Puget Sound, where we built what I thought was an unbreakable family bond that would sustain us through any crisis life could throw our way. David was born in 1981, our firstborn son who came into the world with bright blue eyes and an insatiable curiosity about everything around him. From his earliest days, David was a special child who seemed to possess an inner light that drew people to him like moths to a flame. He was brilliant, creative, and compassionate, with a natural ability to make anyone feel important and valued. Sarah followed 2 years later, a beautiful daughter with dark hair and her mother's gentle spirit. She was quieter than David, more introspective and artistic, with a talent for music that emerged when she was barely old enough to hold a violin. Both children brought joy and purpose to our lives, but I have to be honest about something that would later destroy my relationship with Sarah forever. David and I shared a special connection from the moment he was born. Perhaps it was because he was my firstborn son, or because we shared so many interests and personality traits, but there was an understanding between us that felt effortless and natural. We could spend hours together working on projects, discussing ideas, or simply enjoying each other's company without feeling the need to fill every moment with conversation. I loved Sarah deeply and completely, but our relationship required more effort and intentionality. She was more like her mother in temperament and interests, preferring quiet activities like reading and music to the outdoor adventures and building projects that David and I enjoyed together. I tried to connect with Sarah through her interests, attending every violin recital and art show, but I never felt the same natural ease with her that I experienced with David. Margaret often pointed out this difference in my relationships with our children, gently encouraging me to spend more one-on-one time with Sarah and to show interest in the things that mattered to her. I thought I was doing a good job of being an attentive father to both children, but looking back, I could see that my connection with David was more visible and effortless than my efforts to bond with Sarah. This dynamic became more pronounced as the children grew older and their personalities became more defined. David excelled in school, particularly in science and mathematics, subjects that I could help him with based on my background as an aerospace engineer. We would spend evenings working through complex problems together, and I felt proud and useful when I could help him understand difficult concepts. Sarah's talents lay in creative areas where I had less expertise to offer. Her music lessons were handled by professional instructors, and her artistic pursuits were encouraged by Margaret, who had a better understanding of creative expression than I did. I attended her performances and praised her achievements, but I couldn't provide the same hands-on guidance and shared enthusiasm that characterized my relationship with David. As both children entered their teenage years, these differences in our relationships became a source of occasional tension within our family. Sarah would sometimes complain that David got more attention, or that I was more interested in his activities than hers. Margaret and I would reassure her that we loved both children equally, but I could see that Sarah perceived favoritism even when none was intended. I tried to address these concerns by making special efforts to spend time with Sarah and show interest in her pursuits. We would go to art museums together, attend concerts, and have conversations about our goals and dreams. But these interactions always felt somewhat forced and artificial compared to the natural flow of my relationship with David. David, for his part, seemed largely unaware of any family dynamics or tensions around parental attention. He was secure in his relationships with both parents and genuinely supportive of Sarah's achievements and interests. If anything, He sometimes encouraged me to spend more time with Sarah and to take a greater interest in her activities. Margaret was a family diplomat who worked to maintain balance and harmony between all of us. She had individual relationships with both children that were strong and meaningful, and she served as a bridge when conflicts or misunderstandings arose. Margaret understood both children's personalities and needs in ways that helped me be a better father to both of them. When Margaret was diagnosed with ovarian cancer in 2015, our family faced its first major crisis together. The diagnosis came suddenly, and the treatment process was aggressive and exhausting. Both David and Sarah rallied around their mother, providing emotional support and practical help during the months of surgery, chemotherapy, and radiation therapy. During Margaret's illness, I found myself leaning heavily on David for support and assistance with family responsibilities. He was 24 years old and working as a software engineer, but he made time to help with Margaret's care, manage household tasks, and provide emotional support to all of us. His natural leadership qualities and problem-solving abilities made him an invaluable partner during this difficult time. Sarah, who was 22 and finishing college, also provided tremendous support, but in different ways that reflected her personality and strengths. She spent hours sitting with Margaret, playing music for her, and providing the kind of gentle companionship that helped ease the emotional burden of fighting cancer. Her artistic sensibility and emotional intelligence were exactly what Margaret needed during her darkest moments. Margaret fought bravely for 18 months, but the cancer ultimately won. Losing her was devastating for all three of us, but it also brought us closer together as we shared our grief and worked to honor her memory. In the months following Margaret's death, David and Sarah both made efforts to stay connected and to help each other through the mourning process. David, who had moved out to his own apartment before Margaret's illness, began visiting more frequently and taking on responsibilities that Margaret had previously handled. He helped me manage household finances, navigate insurance claims, and maintain the house that had become too large and quiet for one person. Sarah, who had been living at home while finishing college, initially stayed to keep me company and to ease the transition to life without Margaret. We developed new routines and traditions that helped both of us cope with the absence of the woman who had been the heart of our family. But after several months, Sarah decided to move to Portland to pursue graduate studies in art therapy. She explained that staying in Seattle was too painful because everything reminded her of her mother, and she needed space to process her grief and build her own independent life. I supported her decision, even though it meant I would be living alone for the first time since Margaret and I had married. David remained in Seattle and became my primary source of family connection and support. We developed a routine of weekly dinners and regular phone calls that helped both of us feel less isolated in our grief. Our relationship, which had always been close, became even stronger as we supported each other through the challenge of rebuilding our lives without Margaret. Sarah stayed in touch through phone calls and occasional visits, but the distance and her busy academic schedule meant that our contact became less frequent over time. When she did visit, I could sense that she felt somewhat excluded from the close relationship that David and I had developed in her absence. She would make comment about how David and I seemed to have our own little world that didn't include her. I tried to reassure Sarah that she was equally important to me and that the frequency of my contact with David was simply a matter of proximity and availability. But I could see that she interpreted our closeness as evidence of the favoritism she had perceived throughout her childhood. These feelings created a subtle tension that we never fully addressed or resolved. The situation became more complicated when David began dating Rebecca, a woman he met through work who quickly became an important part of his life. Rebecca was intelligent, kind, and clearly devoted to David, and I welcomed her into our family circle. She often joined us for our weekly dinners and quickly became someone I considered a daughter-in-law even before any formal engagement. Sarah seemed to have mixed feelings about Rebecca's presence in our family. On one hand, she genuinely liked Rebecca and was happy that David had found love. On the other hand, Rebecca's integration into our family dynamics seemed to reinforce Sarah's sense that she was somehow peripheral to the core family unit that now consisted of David, Rebecca, and me. When David and Rebecca announced their engagement in late 2021, I was thrilled for them and proud to be gaining a daughter-in-law who clearly made David happy. I offered to help with wedding expenses and began planning to give David a meaningful gift that would help them start their married life on solid financial ground. Sarah's reaction to the engagement was more complicated. She was happy for David, but also seemed hurt that she had learned about the engagement through a phone call rather than being present for the proposal or the initial celebration. She felt like an outsider to major family events and milestones, a perception that created distance and resentment. The wedding took place in June 2022, a beautiful ceremony overlooking the water where David and Rebecca exchanged vows surrounded by family and friends. I was honored to serve as David's best man, and I gave a speech about watching him grow from a curious little boy into the fine man who stood before us. It was one of the proudest moments of my life. Sarah attended the wedding and participated in the festivities, but I could sense that she felt uncomfortable with the attention and celebration focused on David. During the reception, she made several comments about how David had always been the favorite child and how his achievements were always celebrated more enthusiastically than hers. I dismissed these comments as temporary emotions related to the stress and sentimentality of a wedding day. I thought Sarah was simply feeling nostalgic about family dynamics and perhaps a bit sad about the changes that marriage would bring to our family structure. I didn't realize that these feelings were building into something much more serious and destructive. After the wedding, David and Rebecca settled into married life in a house they bought in the suburbs, while I continued living in the family home where I had raised both children. David and I maintained our routine of regular contact, though our dinners became less frequent as he adjusted to married life and the responsibilities that came with homeownership. Sarah completed her graduate program and moved back to Seattle, taking a job as an art therapist with a nonprofit organization that served at-risk youth. I was delighted to have her back in the same city and looked forward to rebuilding our relationship and creating new traditions that would include her more fully in our family activities. But Sarah seemed distant and somewhat resentful when she returned to Seattle. She rarely initiated contact with me, and when we did spend time together, she often made pointed comments about my relationship with David and Rebecca. She would ask why I called David more frequently than I called her, or why I seemed more interested in David's work projects than in her career. I tried to address these concerns by making conscious efforts to contact Sarah more regularly and to show interest in her professional achievements. But every interaction felt strained and artificial, as if we were both aware that I was trying to correct an imbalance rather than expressing natural interest and affection. The tension came to a head during Thanksgiving 2022, when Sarah made direct accusations about my favoritism toward David. She said that she had always felt like the less important child, that my pride in David's achievements had overshadowed my recognition of her accomplishments, and that my close relationship with him had left her feeling excluded and unloved. I was shocked by the intensity of Sarah's feelings and tried to explain that any differences in my relationships with my children were due to personality compatibility and proximity, rather than differences in love or pride. I assured her that I loved both my children equally and that I was equally proud of their achievements, even if I expressed that pride in different ways. But Sarah was not satisfied with my explanations. She said that love without demonstration was meaningless, and that my actions throughout her life had shown clearly that David was my preferred child. She accused me of giving David more emotional support, more financial assistance, and more attention than I had ever given her. The conversation became heated and painful, with both of us saying things that we probably shouldn't have said. Sarah stormed out of my house that evening, and we didn't speak for several weeks afterward. When we finally did reconnect, it was through a tense phone call where we both apologized but didn't really resolve the underlying issues that caused our conflict. The months that followed were characterized by a fragile peace where Sarah and I maintained minimal contact while carefully avoiding topics that might reignite our argument. She rarely visited my house, preferring to meet for coffee or lunch in neutral locations where our interactions felt more like meetings between acquaintances than conversations between father and daughter. David was aware of the tension between Sarah and me, and he tried to mediate our relationship by encouraging both of us to be more understanding and forgiving. He suggested family therapy or counseling that might help us work through our communication problems and rebuild our relationship on a healthier foundation. But before we could address these family dynamics, tragedy struck in the most unexpected and devastating way possible. On March 15th, 2023, David was driving home from work during an evening rainstorm when a drunk driver ran a red light and crashed into his car at high speed. David was killed instantly, along with a drunk driver who had caused the accident. The phone call informing me of David's death was the worst moment of my life. I had lost my wife to cancer and had endured that grief, but losing a child felt like a different kind of destruction that threatened to tear apart everything I believed about life, love, and meaning. David was only 41 years old, just beginning his married life, with so much potential and joy ahead of him. Rebecca was devastated beyond words, having lost not only her husband but her best friend and the father of the children they had planned to have together. I tried to support her through her grief while managing my own overwhelming sorrow and the practical details that death requires in terms of funeral arrangements and legal matters. I called Sarah immediately after receiving the news, and her initial reaction was shock and disbelief that quickly gave way to profound grief. Despite our recent tensions, Sarah had loved her brother deeply and was devastated by the sudden and senseless nature of his death. She drove to my house that night, and we held each other and cried together for the first time in years. The days leading up to David's funeral were a blur of arrangements, visitors, and shared mourning. Sarah and I worked together to plan a service that would honor David's life and provide comfort to the many people who had loved him. For a brief time, our shared grief seemed to bridge the gap that had developed between us. But as the shock of David's death began to wear off, Sarah's grief transformed into something darker and more destructive. She began making comments about how unfair it was that David had died when he was a good child, the successful child, the one who had everything to live for. She started suggesting that fate had taken the wrong person, that David's death was a cosmic injustice. These comments made me uncomfortable, but I attributed them to the irrational thoughts that grief can produce. People say things they don't mean when they're processing overwhelming loss, and I assumed that Sarah's anger would eventually soften into sadness and then into acceptance. The funeral service was beautiful and well attended, with hundreds of people coming to pay their respects to David and support our family through this tragedy. I delivered a eulogy about David's life, his achievements, and the joy he had brought to everyone who knew him. I spoke about his kindness, his intelligence, and his bright future that had been cut tragically short. Sarah also spoke at the service, delivering a moving tribute to her brother that focused on their childhood memories and the love they had shared despite their different personalities and interests. Her speech was eloquent and touching, and I was proud of her ability to honor David's memory even in the midst of her own grief. But after the formal service, as we gathered at my house for the reception, Sarah's demeanor changed dramatically. She became increasingly agitated and emotional, making comments to relatives and friends about how David had always been a favorite child and how his death was especially tragic because he was the one who mattered most to our family. These comments were embarrassing and hurtful, particularly because they were made in front of David's widow and the many people who had come to support our family. I tried to calm Sarah down and redirect her attention to the purpose of the gathering, which was to celebrate David's life and comfort each other in our shared loss. But Sarah's anger continued to escalate throughout the afternoon, and she began making increasingly direct accusations about my parenting and my relationship with both children. She told anyone who would listen that David had always been the golden child, while she had been ignored and undervalued throughout her life. The breaking point came when Sarah approached me directly in front of a group of mourners and family friends. Her face was flushed with anger and grief, and her voice was loud enough for everyone nearby to hear clearly. She looked me in the eyes and said the words that would haunt me for the rest of my life. She told me that it was unfair that David had died because he was a child I actually loved and cared about. She said that if one of us had to die, it should have been me instead of David, because David's life mattered more than mine ever would. She accused me of destroying her life through favoritism and neglect, and she said that losing David was punishment for being a terrible father to her. The room fell silent as Sarah's words hung in the air like a toxic cloud that poisoned everything around us. I was stunned into speechlessness, unable to comprehend that my daughter had just told me she wished I were dead instead of her brother. The pain of her words was worse than any physical injury I had ever experienced. Rebecca, who had been standing nearby, immediately intervened and asked Sarah to leave the house. Other family members and friends tried to calm the situation and provide damage control, but the harm had already been done. Sarah had publicly blamed me for David's death and expressed a wish for my own death in front of everyone who had come to mourn my son. Sarah left my house that afternoon and has not spoken to me since. In the 8 months following David's funeral, she has refused to answer my phone calls, respond to my letters, or acknowledge my existence in any way. She has blocked me on social media and has told other family members that she never wants to see or hear from me again. The silence from Sarah has been almost as devastating as losing David. Not only am I grieving the death of my son, but I'm also dealing with complete rejection and hatred of my daughter. I lost 2 children in one day, one to a car accident and one to anger and resentment that have been building for years. I've tried to understand Sarah's perspective and to acknowledge the ways that my parenting may have contributed to her feelings of being less valued than her brother. I've spent countless hours examining my memories and my actions, looking for evidence of favoritism that Sarah perceives, and trying to understand how love could be interpreted as indifference. I've also sought help from grief counselors and therapists who have helped me understand the complex dynamics of family relationships and the ways that sibling rivalry can persist into adulthood. These professionals have helped me see that Sarah's accusations, while painful, are more about her own insecurities and grief than about objective reality. But understanding the psychology behind Sarah's behavior doesn't ease the pain of her rejection or restore our relationship. I continue to hope that time and her own grief counseling will help Sarah work through her anger and find a way back to our family connection. But as months pass without any contact, I'm beginning to accept that I may have lost both of my children forever. The loneliness has been overwhelming. I'm 71 years old, living alone in a house that once contained a thriving family, but now feels like a mausoleum of memories. The silence is broken only by phone calls from Rebecca, who remains supportive and caring despite her own grief, and by the occasional visit from extended family members who try to provide comfort and companionship. I've considered selling the house and moving somewhere smaller, but I can't bear the thought of leaving the place where I raised David and Sarah and where I built a life with Margaret. The house contains too many precious memories to abandon, even though those same memories are now sources of pain as well as comfort. I've also struggled with guilt and self-doubt about my role in Sarah's alienation. Perhaps she was right about favoritism, and perhaps my relationship with David did overshadow my connection with her in ways that caused lasting psychological damage. Maybe I failed as a father in ways that I'm unable to see or acknowledge, and maybe Sarah's anger is justified. But then I remember the love I felt for both children, the pride I took in both of their achievements, and the efforts I made to support and encourage both of them throughout their lives. I remember Sarah's violin recitals where I sat in the front row and applauded enthusiastically, the art projects we worked on together, and the conversations we had about her dreams and goals. The most painful part of this experience has been the realization that love alone is not enough to prevent family destruction. I love both of my children completely and unconditionally, but that love was not sufficient to overcome the complex dynamics of personality differences, sibling rivalry, and perceived inequities that have been building for decades. But something unexpected happened 6 months after David's funeral that gave me a glimmer of hope in the darkness of my grief and isolation. I received a phone call from Dr. Linda Patterson, a family therapist who specialized in grief counseling and estranged family relationships. Dr. Patterson explained that she had been working with Sarah as her individual therapist and had permission to contact me about the possibility of family mediation. Dr. Patterson told me that Sarah was struggling with overwhelming guilt about her behavior at David's funeral and the things she had said to me in her anger and grief. While Sarah was not ready to contact me directly, she was open to the possibility of working with a mediator to address the issues between us and potentially rebuild our relationship. The therapist explained that Sarah's anger toward me was rooted in legitimate feelings of being less valued as a child, but that her expression of those feelings had been distorted by the intensity of her grief over losing David. Sarah was beginning to understand that her anger toward me was partially displaced grief over her brother's death and her own feelings of survivor's guilt. Dr. Patterson suggested that we begin with individual therapy sessions for both Sarah and me, followed by joint sessions if we both felt ready to engage in that process. She warned me that rebuilding our relationship would take time and patience, and that there were no guarantees about the outcome. I immediately agreed to participate in any process that might help heal the rift between Sarah and me. The thought of having even a slim chance of rebuilding our relationship was worth any amount of effort or emotional difficulty that therapy might require. The individual therapy sessions have been challenging, but helpful in giving me tools to process my grief over David's death, while also examining my role in the family dynamics that contributed to Sarah's alienation. I've learned to acknowledge the ways that my natural connection with David may have inadvertently made Sarah feel less important, even when that was never my intention. I've also learned that healing our relationship will require me to take responsibility for my part in Sarah's feelings of being undervalued, while also helping her understand that those feelings don't justify the cruel things she said at David's funeral. We both need to find ways to honor David's memory while building a new relationship that acknowledges past hurts and creates better patterns for the future. The joint therapy sessions began 3 months ago and have been emotionally difficult, but gradually productive. Sarah has been able to express her feelings about our childhood relationship in a safe environment where her emotions can be validated without being destructive. I've been able to acknowledge my mistakes while also explaining my perspective and intentions as her father. Most importantly, we've both been able to grieve David's death together and support each other through the ongoing process of accepting our loss. Sarah has begun to understand that my love for David doesn't diminish my love for her, and that losing him is a tragedy we can share rather than a source of competition between us. We still have a long way to go in rebuilding trust and intimacy in our relationship, but for the first time since David's funeral, I have hope that I might not have lost both of my children forever. Sarah has agreed to start having monthly dinners together, supervised by Dr. Patterson initially, where we can practice communicating in healthier ways. She's also expressed interest in going through David's belongings together and creating a memorial that honors his life while bringing our family closer together. These small steps toward reconciliation feel like miracles after 8 months of complete silence and rejection. Today, nearly a year after David's death, I'm still grieving the loss of my son and may never fully recover from that devastation. But I'm also cautiously optimistic that Sarah and I can rebuild our relationship and create a new kind of family bond that honors both David's memory and our own capacity for healing and forgiveness. The experience has taught me that family relationships are fragile and complex, requiring constant attention and care to maintain healthy dynamics. It has also shown me that even the most severe damage can sometimes be repaired with professional help, mutual effort, and a willingness to acknowledge mistakes and change destructive patterns. That's my story. How my son's death turned my daughter against me and made her wish I had died instead of him, but how therapy and time are slowly healing the wounds that grief and resentment had torn in our family. Sometimes tragedy destroys everything in its path, but sometimes it also creates opportunities for deeper understanding and stronger connections than existed before.